So use extra, extra virgin olive oil. It's 100% pure, like me.
It was filmed, finished, scheduled, and then quietly pulled off the air days before it was supposed to premiere. No public explanation. No press release. Just gone. For over a decade, fans of one of the most outrageous sitcoms in American television history heard whispers about an episode that supposedly existed but that nobody could actually find. Some assumed it had been destroyed. Some assumed the whole story was an urban legend cooked up by diehard fans. But the episode was real. It was sitting on a shelf the entire time. And the reason it got buried says a lot more about the anxious, panic culture of late 1980s network television than it does about the episode itself. This is the story of I'll See You in Court, the Married with Children episode Fox refused to touch for 13 years. To understand why this particular episode became radioactive, you have to understand what Married with Children was doing to the American living room in the first place. When it premiered on the brand new Fox network in 1987, sitcoms were still mostly playing by the rules set by shows like The Cosby Show and Family Ties, warm families, gentle lessons, a hug before the credits rolled. Married with Children took that formula and threw it in a dumpster. Al Bundy was a miserable shoe salesman who openly resented his wife, his kids, and the life he'd ended up with. Peggy Bundy didn't cook, didn't clean, and spent her days on the couch watching talk shows. Kelly and Bud weren't precocious little angels. They were self-centered, conniving, and constantly at each other's throats. The show wasn't interested in comforting anybody. It wanted to be crude, cynical, and relentlessly funny. And for a huge chunk of the country, that hit a nerve in exactly the right way. It became one of the signature hits that helped a fourth network survive its earliest and most fragile years. But that same rawness that made the show popular also made it a lightning rod. Critics called it tasteless. Parent groups called it dangerous. And because Fox was still trying to prove it belonged in the same conversation as ABC, NBC, and CBS, every controversy carried extra weight. The network needed advertisers to trust that this scrappy new channel wasn't going to blow up in their faces, and Married with Children kept testing exactly how far that trust could stretch. By early 1989, the show was in its third season, ratings were climbing fast, and the writer's room was cranking out scripts that pushed the envelope even further than before. One of those scripts was called I'll See You in Court. On paper, it read like a completely ordinary Bundy misadventure. Peggy decides their marriage needs a spark, so she convinces Al to check into a cheap motel called the Hop-On Inn for a romantic night away from the kids. When they arrive, they stumble across a videotape left behind in the room. Curious, they pop it in, expecting a datey movie to help set the mood. Instead, they discover it's a secretly recorded tape of their neighbors, Steve and Marcia Rhodes, who had stayed at the same motel and had no idea they'd been filmed. The Bundys think it's hilarious, right up until they realize the motel had done the exact same thing to them. Furious and humiliated, both couples decide to sue the motel owner. The case goes to court. The tapes become evidence, and in true Bundy fashion, the outcome is less about justice and more about one final embarrassing punchline that plays out on the judge's own bench. It was written by Gene Baruch and Gene Romano, two writers who were relatively new to the show, and directed by Jerry Cohen, a veteran of the series. It was taped in early January of 1989, and the plan was straightforward. Aired as episode 10 of season 3 in mid-February, and move on to the next outrageous storyline like always. Nobody involved in making it thought they were sitting on something that would end up shelved for 13 years. What changed everything wasn't the episode itself. It was the timing. A few weeks before I'll See You in Court was supposed to air, Fox had broadcast a different Married with Children episode called Her Cups Runneth Over, a fairly typical Bundy storyline built around Al hunting down Peggy's favorite discontinued bra at a lingerie store. It was silly. It was full of the show's usual innuendo, and under normal circumstances it would have come and gone without much fuss. Instead, it landed in front of a Michigan mother of four named Terry Ricolta, who was appalled by what she saw playing on network television in the middle of the evening. Ricolta didn't just complain to her local station. She wrote directly to the show's advertisers, urging them to pool their support. And her campaign worked. Several major sponsors backed off. The story made national news, and suddenly Fox wasn't just dealing with one annoyed viewer. It was dealing with a public relations crisis at the exact moment it could least afford one. That's the environment I'll See You in Court was dropped into. A network already bruised by boycott headlines, already fielding anxious calls from advertisers, was now staring down an episode about secretly recorded sex tapes and a courtroom scene built entirely around the outcome of that footage. Fox's Broadcast Standards Department went through the script line by line and came back with a long list of required changes, reportedly around 15 individual notes, which was far more than the show typically received on any single episode. The writers and producers agreed to some of them, but they pushed back hard on others, arguing that the changes would gut what made the episode work in the first place. Rather than keep fighting over the rewrites, and rather than risk another advertiser exodus while the Racolta story was still fresh in the news, Fox made the call to simply not air it. No public statement. No announcement to the press. The episode just disappeared from the schedule, and Married with Children moved on to other stories as if it had never existed. For the cast and crew, this was genuinely strange. Nothing about I'll See You in Court felt more extreme than plenty of episodes that had already made it to air without incident. Series co-creator Michael Moy later discussed the situation in an interview, describing the whole ordeal as almost absurd in hindsight, given how thoroughly every single line was picked apart during a period when the network was on edge over an entirely different episode. From where the writers sat, the show wasn't being punished for what it actually contained. It was being punished for arriving at the worst possible moment. Here's the part that tends to surprise people who assume banned means banned everywhere. The episode wasn't locked away worldwide. It aired internationally throughout 1989 and into 1990, reaching audiences in other countries without much controversy at all. It was only in the United States, the one market where the Racolta boycott had actually done damage, that the episode stayed off the air. For American fans, that made the whole situation even stranger. Word would occasionally trickle back that I'll See You in Court had aired just fine overseas, which only fueled the sense that this wasn't really about decency standards so much as it was about a Navis network trying to avoid another news cycle. And so the episode became a kind of ghost. It wasn't included when the show went into syndication. It didn't show up in the early home video releases. Episode guides from the era would sometimes skip right over it or list it without explanation. If you were a casual fan tuning in during reruns through the 90s, you'd have no idea it existed at all. But among the show's most dedicated viewers, rumors persisted. Some people swore they'd caught a bootleg copy at a convention. Others insisted it had aired once, late at night, and then vanished again. The reality was far less dramatic than any of the legends. The tape simply sat in Fox's library, untouched, while the show around it kept running for 8 more seasons and eventually wrapped its original run in 1997. It took until 2002, 5 years after the series finale, for I'll See You in Court to finally reach American television. FX, which by then held the cable rerun rights to the entire Married with Children catalog, quietly slotted it into the rotation on June 18th of that year. There was no big campaign around it, no special introduction explaining the backstory, just the episode itself airing more than 13 years after it was originally taped. Even then, it wasn't shown completely untouched. A handful of lines were still trimmed for the cable broadcast. It wasn't until the episode showed up on home video, as part of a Season 3 DVD release and later on a collection of the show's more notorious episodes, that viewers could finally watch it exactly as it was shot back in January of 1989. When people did finally see it, the reaction was almost anticlimactic in the best way. After years of rumors painting I'll See You in Court as some kind of forbidden, line-crossing extreme, most viewers found it to be a pretty standard episode of Married with Children. It had the same rhythm as dozens of other episodes, a ridiculous premise, a parade of innuendo, a courtroom full of jokes at everyone's expense, and a final gag that's more embarrassing than shocking. If you dropped it into the middle of the show's run without any context, there's a real chance nobody would flag it as unusual at all. That gap between its reputation and its actual content became part of the story itself. Michael Moy has pointed out how funny it is, in retrospect, that an episode built around such an ordinary Bundy plot ended up being treated like contraband for over a decade, simply because of when it happened to be scheduled. So why does an episode this minor still get talked about today, more than 3.5 decades after it was shot? Part of it is simple curiosity about lost media. There's a whole corner of the internet built around digging up unaired pilots, deleted scenes, and shelved episodes, and I'll See You in Court is one of the cleanest examples of that phenomenon. A complete, professionally produced episode of a hit show that audiences in its home country simply weren't allowed to see for over a decade, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the episode's actual content. But there's also something a little more uncomfortable sitting underneath the jokes. The premise, being secretly filmed in a private moment and having that footage exist without your knowledge or consent, plays very differently now than it did in 1989. Back then, hidden motel cameras were a punchline, a slightly seedy detail that made the plot feel scandalous in an abstract, almost cartoonish way. Today, we live in a world shaped by smartphone cameras, hacked cloud accounts, leaked private photos, and the very real, very damaging phenomenon of non-consensual intimate images being shared without permission. Watching the Bundys and the Rhodes discover they'd been filmed without their knowledge lands differently when audiences have spent the last decade reading real headlines about exactly that kind of violation happening to real people. The show, of course, plays the whole thing for laughs, and it never asks viewers to sit with the discomfort for more than a few seconds before the next joke arrives. But the fact that the premise still resonates at all says something about how far ahead of its time the setup accidentally was, even if the execution was pure late 80s sitcom silliness. There's also the courtroom angle, which is aged into something almost satirical in hindsight. The episode's resolution hinges on whether a jury believes the Bundys actually had sex based on how long the tape runs, a joke about male inadequacy dressed up as a legal outcome. It's absurd, and it's clearly meant to be absurd. But there's a sliver of real commentary buried in there about how legal systems can end up focusing on the wrong details entirely when someone's privacy has been violated, more interested in technicalities than in the fact that a violation happened at all. Married with Children was never trying to make a serious statement about consent or surveillance law. It was trying to get a laugh every 15 seconds. But sometimes a joke built on a genuinely uncomfortable premise ends up saying more than the writers intended, just by being funny enough that audiences remember it decades later. The other reason this story keeps resurfacing has less to do with the episode's content, and more to do with what it reveals about how television networks operated under pressure. Fox in 1989 wasn't the massive, entrenched player it is today. It was still the new kid trying to prove it could survive against three much older, much more established networks, and that meant every controversy carried outsized risk. A single boycott campaign from one determined viewer was enough to make advertisers nervous, and nervous advertisers were enough to make an entire network quietly bury a finished episode rather than risk a second news cycle. It's a small, very specific example of how fragile the balance was between pushing boundaries and getting cancelled outright, and how much of what actually reaches an audience depends on factors that have nothing to do with quality or even content, and everything to do with timing. What makes the ending of this story satisfying is that nothing about it required some dramatic reversal or corporate change of heart. There was no scandal that forced Fox's hand, no lawsuit, no viral campaign that finally shamed the network into releasing it. The episode simply outlasted the environment that buried it. By the time cable reruns and home video collections rolled around, the specific advertiser panic of 1989 was long gone. The show itself had already finished its entire 11-season run, and I'll See You in Court could finally be judged on its own terms instead of through the lens of a boycott that had nothing to do with it. It went from being the episode Fox was too scared to air to being just another entry in the show's very long list of ridiculous, envelope-pushing storylines, sitting comfortably next to everything else Ole and Peggy Bundy ever put audiences through. If there's a lesson buried in this whole saga, it's probably about how quickly the definition of too much for television can shift. An episode that once felt so risky a network wouldn't touch it now plays as one of the tamer entries in a show that spent 11 seasons trying to offend as many people as possible on purpose. What got it shelved wasn't some uniquely scandalous joke. It was rotten timing, a boycott aimed at a completely different episode, and a network too nervous to take one more risk while it was already under fire. Decades later, the episode is easy enough to find, sitting right there in the show's complete run for anyone who wants to watch it. No longer lost, no longer banned, just another Bundy family disaster finally getting to exist in the open. If you're into stories about shows, episodes, and moments television tried to keep buried, there's a lot more of this kind of history out there worth digging into, and plenty of it is just as strange as this one turned out to be.